Welcome, everyone. My name's Pam Boland. I'm the Director of Education for the Institute. Thank you for coming tonight. We have other colleagues here from the Institute. Tracy Hollidays, our Executive Director. And we have Beth Scrovan and Lynn Teach. They're our wonderful environmental and history educators. Thank you again for coming out. Few announcements. If you look at the green card, we put a different card tonight on your seat. It lists all of our spring happenings. So I have been asked by several people tonight about Jerry Jones's geology talk, which will be here in the beginning of April. And then Saturday, April 9th is a trip to the Gettysburg battlefield. And you can get all the information on our website. And the website is listed at the bottom of this card. And for the rest of March, we have on Sunday, Lynn is leading our story walk at Pine Hill for families. So just register with the Institute if you'd like to take the kids on a story walk. And we are also having a campfire with s'mores. And then next Sunday, the last Sunday in March, we have an Appalachian Trail hike that will be led by Dave Graff. So if you need any information, see one of us tonight or check out the website. Also on the back table, I'll draw your attention to, we have other forms in the back, and one is our membership form if you'd like to become a member of the Institute. And we also have Woodsy Owl if you'd like to drop in a donation tonight. Hey, I'd also like to thank the Church of Apostles for letting us use this wonderful fellowship hall. I'd also like to thank Grace and Bob Brown for underwriting our program tonight, or actually the whole series from last week's Claire's program and tonight Andre's program. So thank you. Also, additional support is by today's Horizon Fund contributors, the Nora Roberts Foundation, John R. Hershey Jr. and Anna L. Hershey Family Foundation, Alma Oyer, APX Enclosures Incorporated, and the Carolyn Terry Eddy family, Carolyn, Connie Flegel, and Kim Larkin. So we thank those contributors to keep all of our programs going. Now tonight's format, it's on Zoom. So Andre is going to be repeating questions for the Zoom folks. And those of you on Zoom, please enter your questions in the chat room, and we're going to do them back and forth tonight. Okay. Andre Weltman, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker. We're glad to have him here tonight. Andre is originally from New York City. After medical school training in New York City and 2 years with the CDC, assigned to the New York State Department of Health in Albany, he moved to central Pennsylvania in 1995 to work for the infectious disease issues for the Pennsylvania Department of Health. He retired in mid-2020 after 25 years of working for the Commonwealth. For the past 24 years, he and his wife have lived in Cook Township, and they're surrounded by the Michaud State Forest. And that's just a couple of miles from the Pine Grove Furnace State Park. Now, Andre is the chairman of the Friends of Pine Grove Furnace State Park, a volunteer nonprofit group that supports education, recreation, and conservation in the park. He frequently gives history lectures and tours of the state park's iron furnace. Every October at the Fall Furnace Fest in the park, Andre leads a living history team to demonstrate the historic process of turning wood into charcoal fuel for the furnace. So we are glad to have you here tonight, Andre. Thank you very much. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you very much. I'm wearing my usual costume, but it's awfully rude to have the hat on, so I am going to take it off, but I thought I just wanted to show it to you. It's the hat. Okay, let's get started. So what I'd like you to do for just a moment is think to yourself what a forest is like. When you imagine the woods, what does it mean to you? When I think about forest, I think about the Michaud State Forest right next to my house. That's where I live and play, basically. And the Michaud State Forest is the spine of the South Mountain Conservation Landscape. And of course, this evening we're in Waynesboro Way at the southern end of that landscape. So maybe you think about the pole steeple overlook and the beautiful ancient rolling hills and the fall foliage, and perhaps taking a hike. This is an unusually flat section of the Appalachian Trail coming through Pine Grove Furnace State Park. There's another dimension to it. When I think about the forest, I also think about a post-industrial forest. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the legacy of the charcoal iron industry. I hope everybody knows that Pennsylvania was once a world leader in making iron and then steel. And this map, slightly adapted from a wonderful book called Mastering Iron. I highly recommend it. It just gives you a sense of the density of iron and steel production even before the American Civil War. So this evening, I'm going to be focusing on the area around Pine Grove Furnace, because that's where I do most of my research in public history. This particular furnace was in operation from, we think, the early 1770s until April of 1895. So call it just before the American Revolution to exactly 30 years after the Civil War, with just a few economic interruptions here and there over that century. So that's a long time. That's one of the more successful of the iron furnaces in the South Mountain region. When you see one of these old stone stacks, you have to keep in mind that it's actually the center of a vanished complex. One of the few examples where that's been kind of rebuilt is at Hopewell National Historic Site, which is about halfway between here and Philadelphia. I always think that Hopewell is what Pine Grove Furnace probably looked like. And I wish we had the kind of resources they do at Hopewell. It's a beautiful place. You'll be seeing more of it this evening. There's the furnace stack, and you see it kind of hidden in the middle there. But now all of those other buildings are gone. So what's the basic process? We're taking three critical raw ingredients: iron ore, limestone, which is called a flux. Think of it like a chemical sponge to bind impurities in the iron ore. And around here, the iron ore is probably a little less than half iron. So we're trying to get rid of the other half of this rock. And importantly, charcoal, lots and lots of charcoal, which is the fuel to make things hot, but also it's a source of carbon for chemical reactions. So here's a kind of cutaway diagram of one of these traditional furnaces. We're loading the iron ore, charcoal, and limestone in the top. We're forcing in air at the bottom. That air under pressure is a blast of air. That's why this is a blast furnace. It's not an explosion in the way we sometimes use that word today. Some high temperature, high volume chemistry occurs. It's not just melting, it's smelting. That's why we use that word. And as part of this chemistry, a lot of hot gases rise to the top and escape. At least in the early days, they just went up into the air, including carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas, a lot of pollutants. And the iron industry is inherently going to generate greenhouse gases. At the bottom, at almost 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, we end up with two critical liquids. One of them is the iron. That's what we're trying to get out of this rock. We let that flow out and solidify, and it becomes pig iron, and then we do various things with it, or maybe we cast it into shapes. We also have a waste product that floats on top of the iron called slag. We'll talk a little more about slag in a few moments. So you're putting in your ingredients, you're forcing air, you get it really hot, and you have to keep this going 24 hours a day. So in that sense, as an industry, in the 18th century, it's a bit unusual. Yes, farmers have to work very hard at certain times of year, but blast furnaces are 24 hours a day, constantly, without stop. And so that's an unusual aspect of industry in that era. So let's think about the impact of this industry on the landscape. And for iron ore and limestone, we get those out of the ground. So there's plenty of evidence of that, which you can easily see to this day. This is a LiDAR map. I'm going to be showing you several of these this evening. So let's take a moment to just think about what it actually is. So I call it a map, but it's really a data set. It's a computer file that can be then shown to you in various ways. A plane flies in a grid pattern back and forth across the entire Commonwealth, and many other places have done this. and shoots a laser down very fast repeatedly, and some of that laser light bounces to the ground and bounces back up. And combined with GPS, you get distance from the airplane. So that's the terrain. And you also, from the GPS, get where you are. You can then tell the computer to show the information to you in various ways. And this is one of the more common ways of doing it. What you're seeing here has flat areas in lighter colors, and steep slopes are darker. So grays and blacks are steep. And this is at Pine Grove Furnace. Fuller Lake is at the top there. The furnace stack is just off the top left of this particular map. So Fuller Lake itself is perhaps the most obvious evidence of the iron industry. Here's what it looked like when it was in operation as an ore pit or ore bank. You'll see both those words. You can also think of it as a quarry. All these terms are the same. I like to use the word pit because by and large, these operations were open pit mines, and I think most people know what that means. So this was Pine Grove pit number 1 or bank number 1, which tells you there were others. This is what it looks like today. It's deep. It actually was about 90 feet deep when they stopped using it. It was below the water table, and between groundwater and rain, it filled up. And you can see the very popular beach in the back of the picture. On the map, there's also kind of a scar on the landscape that is not flooded with water. That's old pit, and that's one of the terms, old pit or old bank, that you see in 19th century geology reports. This is what it looks like. And I do take tours in there. And by the way, when you go into these old quarries or banks or pits, you can still find plenty of iron ore. It's not like they scooped up every last molecule of the stuff. So I'm showing off a piece of iron ore to a member of the public. From its name, I would surmise that old pit was probably where iron ore was mined for the Pine Grove Furnace operation back around the time of the Revolution. Somewhere in the early 1800s, they finished using that and went just a few hundred yards away, probably the same vein of iron ore, and that's now Fuller Lake. Looking down at the bottom of the map, well, in the middle, you've got a limestone quarry. You can see that as you drive along through the state park, if you know to look for it. At the bottom of the map, there's some kind of pockmarks on the landscape, and those are Thomas Iron Company iron ore banks or the red banks. Here's what they look like today in the middle of the woods. These are not right there next to the road. They're just a series of fairly large depressions. The photograph doesn't do it justice. And I think if you don't know that this is an iron mining area and you just went tramping through the woods or you were deer hunting or something and came upon this huge excavation, you'd probably be rather puzzled. But this is just evidence of the iron industry. Here's another LiDAR map over on the other end of the state park. So that's Laurel Lake, which was originally called Laurel Forge Pond, because the purpose of this body of water was always to be water. So it's not a flooded ore pit. This is to provide water power to a forge, which is just above the dam in the middle of the picture there. That's long gone, and now it is a gravel parking lot below the modern dam. So when people visit this area, they're usually going to Pole Steeple, an extremely popular hiking trail, which we'll also talk more about this evening. They drive right past one of the flooded ore pits. So on the east side of this map, on the right there, you've got Laurel Pit number 1. And again, in this LiDAR map, it's flat, so it's a light color. And there's another one further up the mountain that's kind of like a scar. That's Laurel 2. Here's Laurel number 1. It's flooded now, but it was about 50 feet deep. And you can just glimpse this if you're driving back Old Railroad Bed Road. The lake is on your right, and this is off to your left. Here's Laurel number 2, several hundred yards away up the mountain when it was in operation. And here's what it looks like today, very much like Old Pit. It's just there. You can walk into it if you know where it is. It's actually not that hard to get to, but almost no one ever visits it. Not all of the scars of the iron industry are large like that. This is a very common thing across the show. We call it a tri-pit in the sense of a test pit. We don't know for sure, but we assume that most of the time what this is a unsuccessful effort to find some iron ore or maybe certain other types of stone. And it doesn't show up very well in the photograph, too far, but there's a fairly regular hole in the ground. They have a kind of typical appearance once you know what they look like. And it's common to find them in a row. There are a few places I've seen them in almost a grid pattern. There's a whole bunch of them side by side. And it seems pretty obvious that someone found maybe a piece of iron ore. And you sometimes find this in the mountain, just a single piece on the ground, and you go, aha, maybe this is going to be the next Fuller pit number one, Pine Grove number one. So maybe a couple guys get out their shovels and dig for a few hours, and they don't find anything else. Are you going to fill the hole back in? No. And so they leave it for us to find 200 years later. So back to our diagram here. Another aspect of iron making that's very important, the hidden ingredient, is the oxygen in air and that blast into the bottom of the furnace. So why can I show you air 200 years later? Well, the reason is, in order to generate that pressurized air, we need water power, we need water wheels, at least until the 1870s at my furnace, where they finally put in the steam engine. So in particular places across the forest, you're going to find long man-made channels. They're often, but not always, still filled with water. And this is, for example, the furnace head race for the water wheel at Pine Grove. It's close to a mile long. And if you know where to look for it when you're driving from our park south on 233 towards Caledonia, just outside the park, if you're driving, don't look, but the passengers can look, and you can actually see this in the woods. It's right there, it's filled with water, and it's running for like 9/10 of a mile. So that's evidence of the water power that was so important for industry, not just for the furnace, but for sawmills, which they also had there, for all sorts of things, for giant pumps, like the pump that kept the Pine Grove number one empty of water when it was in use. So that water wheel is turning, and it's pushing some very large pistons or blowing tubs. And here's what that would have looked like. So that's at Hopewell. I want to steal it and install it at our furnace. They have to rebuild it about every 20 years. So maybe they wouldn't mind if I took it and just had a few years out of it. So I mentioned earlier the waste product, the slag that floats on top of the iron inside the furnace. That's drawn off every so often and allowed to solidify and then pretty much thrown away. Now, those of you in the room this evening can see all of these pieces of slag in the back of the room in my little museum back there. All of these pieces came from Pine Grove Furnace. So these were all produced in the iron making operation, but obviously they're very different colors and textures. The bright blue, sort of the sky blue, is due to manganese in some of the iron ore, especially out of Laurel Pit number one. But the rest of it really just reflects different chemistry of iron, different acid-base balance and temperatures, and small impurities. So in the old days, the iron masters didn't know the chemistry that was going on inside the blast furnace. So finding sort of the dull gray and dull green colors would have made them happy. Not many furnaces have a lot of that bright blue stuff that we often produced at Pine Grove in the later years. If weird colors start showing up in your slag, it might mean that the iron is not being formed correctly, and it might be not the right purity. It might have too much phosphorus. All sorts of things could happen. So they liked kind of the boring colors. School children and others come and pick up pieces of slag, and of course they prefer to get the bright colored stuff. The gray and green is boring, and usually people don't pick it up, but that is what the iron masters wanted to find. Now, some of this stuff could be brought up onto the mountain if there was a road that had a hole in it and used as road fill. They would sometimes dump it between railroad ties after our railroad was built in 1870 to hold the railroad down, so it's ballast for the railroad. But by and large, in these old operations, they just threw it away, and they would pile it higher and higher. This is the slag pile or cinder heap. That's another term, cinder, for this. This is only a couple hundred yards from the Iron Master's mansion at Pine Grove, but it's lost back in the woods right along the creek. In places, it's as much as 40 feet above the water, and it extends for something like 100 yards along the edge of the creek, and it's all hidden back in there. This is an entirely man-made mountain of slag, just thousands upon thousands of tons of the stuff. And it's been there so long that trees are actually growing out of it. But if you walk on it, you can feel that it's nothing but pieces of slag. So for the rest of the evening, I'd like to focus on charcoal, the fuel for the furnace, which really is the most widespread, and once you know to look for it, the most obvious aspect of iron making all across the Michelle. So let's talk about charcoal hearths. So what's the process here? Well, we're piling up lengths of wood in a particular way and covering them with dirt and leaves to block most oxygen in the air. A little bit of oxygen can get in because we do want this thing to burn just a little bit. Here's a more three-dimensional representation of it. These could be very large, or they could be smaller. The bigger it is, the longer it takes, but also the more efficient it is. So here we've got a pit above ground. It's a little confusing. I've been using that word this evening already, talking about mining pits, open pit mining. And also I mentioned a tri-pit. Well, here's yet another use of that word. The pit is the above ground mound of wood. The flat round area on the mountainside where we build a pit is called a hearth. At least these are the terms we use in Eastern North America. In England, the pit might actually be called a clamp. The hearth might be called a platform. A Meiler is another, M-E-I-L-E-R, is another term coming from German language usage that you'll see in the literature, but we tend to use pit and hearth in this part of the world. An industrial operation needs industrial quantities of charcoal. So these pits are really big. Typically, they might be 20 to 30 feet across at the base. And for those of us in the room, that's pretty much the entire width of this room, okay? And those 4-foot lengths of wood, which we call billets, stacked up in a particular way, might be anywhere from 10 to 12 or even a little bit bigger. And then we're going to cover it in several feet of dirt and leaves on top. So you might reach 12 to 14 feet at the top. And there's a guy standing off to the left, give you some sense. This one looks to be, roughly 10 or 12 feet tall. Now, I've got over here a sapling that I like to use when I do this kind of tour at the park. And I lift it up, and this is 14 feet tall, just to show you a full-size one, including all the dirt and leaves on top. It turns out the room we're in is only about 12 feet tall. So since I don't want to break the lights, I'm just leaning it over there, but it gives you some feeling, I hope, for just how large a pit could be. Not all of them are necessarily that big. Here's the rest of that photograph. It's from New Jersey in 1936. So they're still doing charcoal making for other reasons, not for iron, I think. On the left, there's a guy standing next to a completed charcoal pit that's about ready to light. And that one looks to be only maybe 5 feet tall. But the other two are bigger and they're not quite completed yet. You need a lot of these. So the rule of thumb was that it took 1 acre of forest, clear cut, so pretty much every tree and sapling, to supply enough wood to become enough charcoal to fuel one of the old iron furnaces for 1 day. So that's 1 acre a day. The woods are allowed to grow back for about 20 or 25 years and then cut again. And when I say grow back, they're growing from the stump, so what we call coppicing. So the trees are never going to get very big after that initial cut. So you're going to cut down 1 acre of forest a day. In the early days of iron making around here, if you were operating 200 or 250 days a year, you were doing really well. So let's say 250, so that's 250 acres of woods cut down. Later on, they started to be better at keeping the furnace going for a long time. So let's say 300. You've also got to produce charcoal for your forge if you have one. And I mentioned Laurel Forge at our park that was built in 1830. You also need regular firewood for your community to stay warm in the winter. You need wood for buildings and fences and all those sorts of things. So conservatively, I think an operation like Pine Grove probably was cutting down 500 acres a year, maybe even double that. And it was pointed out in the 19th century that if you're going to cut the forest on a 20 or 25-year cycle, and you want to do this repeatedly, you're looking to have your industry last a long time, you probably want to own about 25 times as much forest land as you need in 1 year. And it's an interesting little bit of math here. Pine Grove Furnace at the end owned 27,000 acres, basically the entire upper middle part of the Michaux State Forest until they bumped into Mount Holly and Boiling Springs furnaces. So 25 times maybe 1,000, 25,000, 27,000, the math actually works out interestingly, doesn't it? Here's a woodcutter or wood chopper in Connecticut. There was a very active charcoal iron industry in Northwest Connecticut called the Salisbury District. He's holding up an axe, And you can see that the hillside behind him doesn't really have any trees on it. And the trees where he's standing, none of them are very large. None of them are really bigger than your leg. Okay. So as you're doing this process and encompassing the woods, you're not cutting down giant oaks over and over again. And in fact, that's convenient because having them smaller means you might not even have to split them. They're just ready to be cut in 4-foot lengths. It took a lot of labor to do this. The single largest job description at one of these old iron furnaces is the woodcutters. And this is just a traditional way of showing the labor organization. This is a seasonal job, however. So it might include iron workers who are not busy at the furnace during the winter time, which is when they normally did this work. It might include some of the charcoal burners who are mostly working in the spring and summer. And it probably included lots of farmers from down in the valley. And they might be cutting enormous amounts of wood. And the iron company always was looking for more workers to come up and do this seasonal labor. On this particular ledger from 1789, if you look closely, you might be able to see it says 89 cords, 99, 90 cords of wood next to a single name. That's a lot of wood. And it's the same cord that we use today, 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot. So these are individuals being paid for generating that much wood and just piling it up in the forest in the cold months. I think that many of the higher numbers, like looks like it's Christian Bush, 90, probably that's a whole family. So that might be a father and sons. It might even include women. This might be a rare example where there could be women out there also. If you could swing an axe without cutting off your own leg, you were probably out there getting a few pennies out of the iron company. In the spring, when the colliers are ready to start making charcoal, you're going to put it onto a skid sled, or this was also called a sledge with a G on the end. And this is just smoothed off timbers. You hook a horse to this thing, it'll slide very nicely across leaves. It's not like a winter sled where you need snow or anything. This is another ledger entry from Pine Grove in 1788. And this shows an enslaved man named Peter, who's recorded as hauling 506 cords in the 10 months and 23 days. So a few things about this. One is the sheer volume of that. So that's probably Peter and a horse. He may not have had anyone else with him, piling it up, dragging it perhaps a quarter mile through the woods. He's going to bring it over to the colliers, go back and get another load, and just nonstop. Okay, that's an enormous amount of wood. And the other thing about this is it is a reminder of slavery in the iron industry. That's something we don't have time to get into in detail this evening, topic for another time perhaps. But many of the early iron masters at Pine Grove Furnace were slaveholders. There was also indentured servitude, and the same ledger entry includes James Cully, who was an indentured servant whose name appears frequently in the records also. So what's the process look like? I'm going to show you some photographs from this really amazing little booklet called American Charcoal Making in the Era of the Coal Blast Furnace. You can find a version of this online on the National Park Service website if you hunt around. It's a wonderful little book. And what happened is in 1936, the federal government basically asked a former collier to come back and do a living history demonstration, okay? And so they documented it and then published it in 1941. Here is one of those sleds with some wood billets, those 4 foot lengths on it. It's being hauled over to where a collier, reenactor, I guess in this case, is preparing a hearth. Remember, that's the flat, round set area on the woods, on the floor of the woods. And you'll notice it's really dark. I suspect that they did this on top of a previously used charcoal hearth, which was common practice. These hearths were used over and over again. In fact, they worked better after the first burn. The billets are dropped off. They're stacked up in a particular manner. And here's a pretty good sized pit ready to be covered, first with leaves. This is called leafing the pit. And then with a mixture of dirt and dust and bits of charcoal. So if you've previously used a hearth, maybe this season, maybe last year, maybe 10 years ago, there's going to be underneath the freshly fallen leaves, a layer of this really nice dust that's filled with little bits of charcoal. And that makes a great cover on the outside of your pit. Here they're firing the pit. So there's a chimney running down the middle and they're going up on top of this thing. And that one's probably 10 feet tall. So they're getting up on top, this rickety ladder. and dumping a few shovelfuls of embers from their campfire. So they fire the pit, and then over the next 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how big it is, they're going to tend the pit. Tending the pit really means staying there and paying attention to it. You don't just walk away from these things, because they will sometimes crack open, they shrink as the wood cooks and turns into charcoal. And if that happens, you might be in trouble because you let in too much oxygen. If you let in too much oxygen, what's going to happen? You've got a bonfire in the woods, and the Iron Master is not going to pay us for ashes. He wants to have nice chunks of charcoal to put in the furnace. This collier is actually showing us part of tending the pit, which is jumping the pit. So part of the process is you need to push down on all sides of the covering of dirt and leaves and find out if there's any soft spots and kind of push them down. It can accumulate gas and actually explode the outside off. They said the pit will blow, and we actually had this happen during my own living history reenactment. It's very exciting when it happens. So he's got to get up there and jump the pit. This thing is 800 to 1,000 degrees inside. And if he should be so unlucky as to fall through, maybe up to his waist, he's going to be very quickly, very badly burned. So the collier reenactor here is showing you that he's got his shovel as a self-rescue tool. If he does fall in, he's going to try to push himself out. Now, this probably didn't happen very often, but if it did happen, it could be fatal. Here's a newspaper report from Connecticut, and very sadly, it's a 10-year-old son of a collier who got up on one of these things and fell through, got himself out, but he was so badly burned in the era before burn units and antibiotics and so forth that he died a while later. I have not been able to find documentation of this kind of accident here in the Michoud State Forest, although it might have occurred. So it probably wasn't very common. There are a couple of reports like this from Connecticut. So this was dangerous work. After maybe a couple of weeks, the charcoal's ready. You open it up. We call that raking the pit. And they're making enormous quantities of charcoal. This might be as much as 6 or 8 tons. Now, the photographs I've been showing you, the gentleman who's up there jumping the pit, this is the last of the standing colliers who used to work at Hopewell when it was an active iron-making operation. His name is Lafayette Houck, or Houck. Lafayette Houck was 82 years old when they did this demonstration. He was climbing on one of those rickety ladders, which in this part of the world are just a piece of log with little steps cut in it. And he fell and injured his shoulder and was unable to complete this demonstration in 1936. So his assistants, which included his son, who's off on the left side there, not a spring chicken himself, they finished the demonstration. Lafayette did live for another 3 years, so he died when he was 85 years old. It may have been hard to follow some of this in these grainy black and white photographs. So I'm going to run through the same process quickly in color. I lead a living history group. Our little collier crew varies from year to year. I happen to have some good photographs from 2017, so that's what I'm going to show you now. Here we are standing next to our pit after it's just been started up. We have a small outdoor museum, much as I did in the back of the room this evening. And this is all for public history. We're trying to show it to people. So here's part of the collier crew building the chimney. When it rises up off the ground, we stuff little pieces of wood into it. That's going to be for the purpose of igniting the whole thing. And then we start stacking billets around it. Now, we're just doing a small one. If it's small, it cooks faster. We only have 24 hours to do this. It's a 2-day festival. We light it in the middle of the day the first day, and we finish it exactly 24 hours later. So ours is pretty small. We're using only 12 or 18-inch long billets, not 4-footers. Keep building it, cover it first with those leaves, leaf the pit, and then we're dusting it. You'll notice the garbage cans, that's because we're in the middle of Fuller Field next to the Park Lake there, and we are trying not to kill the grass too much. So we scoop up the dirt and dust and charcoal and so forth from the previous year's demonstration and store it until the following October's festival. So that's a little bit inaccurate, but I'll tell you that very dusty dirt really works well for this process. Here's our pit ready to fire. It's about this high. We dumped some embers from our campfire into the top. It's very exciting. You can see all the people watching. And then we cover it. So the chimney is covered with more dirt and leaves. This is just at the very beginning, so the smoke is starting to come out the top. And we stand there and talk to people. I mean, that's the whole point of this. And we do that all day. And then we stay up all night. We tend the pit. We take turns so that we have a couple of us awake just for this one little demonstration pit for the entire evening. If you go away from it, you can lose control of it. Not only would we not make charcoal, but we might burn the park down. And I really don't want to do that. So the next day, second day of the festival, we pull it apart, we rake the pit. And this is very exciting because as oxygen hits those fresh, hot pieces of charcoal, they sometimes catch fire, and then we have to kind of smother them. We do use water, or sometimes the old timers prefer to just put a little dirt on it or flip it upside down so that it was smothered against the ground. Typically, we make around 250 pounds or so. Our best year a couple of years back before the pandemic was, I think, 315 pounds. What do we do with it? We bag it up, 5-pound bags, and we sell it. People are very eager to buy this stuff from us, and they barbecue with it. So if you want it, there may or may not be some left on the first day of the festival from the previous year. We sell out every year. One other point about our living history reenactment, we're pretty clean. I mean, we do get dirty and smoky and everything, but the old timers said that being too clean was a sign of inexperience, and I suspect they would have laughed at us. Here's an actual charcoal making effort. This is in Ohio in 1942. They were probably doing this for other uses of the carbon. You can see these two brothers, and I think his name is Floyd Malone on the right there, is filthy. You can see how much charcoal dust he has on him, and the younger brother is pretty dirty also. So we try not to get that filthy because I also come out and talk to people, and I'll tell you, this costume stinks even after I wash it 2 or 3 times. So indeed, that smoke coming off of our charcoal demonstration pit is very thick and oily. It's kind of got a chemical feel to it. It's not really like a regular campfire. Here's what it looks like. You can see there's quite a lot of smoke, and that's nonstop. As the process works from the top to bottom, there's kind of a line of smoke there, and it slowly descends. When that line of smoke hits the ground, it's called coming to foot, and that's one indication that we're almost done. So that smoke is carrying away chemicals. So what's the process here? It's called pyrolysis. Remember, it's not just a bonfire. We're not just burning wood in the open air. It's thermochemical decomposition of organic material. You can do this with almost anything. You can put a sandwich in there and you'll get some sort of carbonized version of it out. But it's in very, very little oxygen. We do allow some oxygen in because in this method, we need to burn some of the wood in order to generate heat to get the process going. You can also call this destructive distillation. If you were to capture that smoke, you might be able to do interesting things with it. So as you go through the 19th century, they started realizing that they could control the process and also capture and condense the smoke if you did this inside a structure, inside a kiln. And eventually, that's how you made charcoal, was in a kiln. And eventually, as the charcoal iron industry went away, you didn't even care about the charcoal. It was a byproduct. You wanted the condensed smoke because it's full of chemicals that are useful feedstocks for the chemical industry. And before maybe the 1920s, when the chemical industry started using a lot of oil and natural gas as its source of materials, of raw materials, it ran on wood. So far, I've been talking about kind of one pit at a time. Let's take a step back here. So here's another LiDAR map. We're looking at pretty much all of Pine Grove Furnace and some of the forest around it. The furnace stack is on the left at that red dot. There's Fuller Lake nearby. And off to the east side, about 2 miles from the furnace, is Laurel Lake. So let's zoom in there. Here's a different way of presenting LiDAR data. This is from a grad student, Sam Bayuzuk up at Penn State, who's been doing some interesting work. And he presented this flipped so that the flat areas are dark and the steep areas are light. It just nicely shows the charcoal hearths. So this is the Pole Steeple hiking trail. And if you look closely, this is a very detailed LiDAR data set. Can you actually see the trail there? Okay. So if you've ever walked it, I'm curious, how many of you in the room have ever walked Pole Steeple? So probably about half of you, maybe more. You know that it's pretty steep in the beginning. And here's Pole Steeple overlooked at the bottom. Did you know you were walking through industrial archaeology on that trail? I've circled a couple of the charcoal hearths, just 2 of them on the right side of the image. You can see that there's a lot more though. I counted about 30 of them in this picture, just in that one little area. We take yet another step back. Here's the majority of the Michaud from the north tip all the way down to about Route 30. This LiDAR map is from Noel Potter Dickinson and his colleagues who did some pioneering work for our region trying to find all the hards. So they're using LiDAR, and Dr. Potter looked on the map and put a yellow dot every time we found one. There are 3,000 yellow dots in this image. And the red dots added later are the locations of furnaces. Pine Grove in the middle. Some of them, maybe you never even heard of. Some of them are not very successful. Chestnut Grove really didn't work very well. Cumberland was pretty early on and not a hugely successful furnace. But you can see that there are a lot of these charcoal hards that you can detect using LiDAR. Same data presented a different way for the area south of Route 30, the southern part of the Michaud. There's maybe another 1,000 dots. Researchers since then, including Shippensburg, have been looking at this and using more detailed LiDAR and doing field work. And the sense is that this technique is undercounting by quite a bit, actually. This particular paper published in 2019 from Shippensburg University, Palmar, and John, who's helping us with the AV this evening. Wave hello, John. He's very modest. So this is just trying to show that it's not the previous the previous map was wrong, it's just incomplete. By some estimates, the grad student up at Penn State thinks there may have been over 7,000 of these across the Michaud. They're everywhere. You can't turn around without stumbling across one. So this may seem a little out of left field here, but how many of you have ever seen the movie The Sixth Sense, 1999? Okay, a few of you. It's a gentle horror film, let's say. If you've not seen it, see it once. It's fun to watch once. It's not that scary. I don't think I'm ruining the plot for you to say that the star of the show is not Bruce Willis. It's this young actor, Haley Joel Osment. And he plays a character who says, I see dead people. I see them everywhere. No one else can see them. Okay? That's all I'm going to tell you about the movie. But this little boy can see dead people. When I'm wandering through the Michaud State Forest, I feel like Haley Joel Osment's character. I feel like The Sixth Sense because I can see charcoal hards. I see them everywhere, and almost no one else can see them. So maybe after this evening, you'll be able to see them too. Here's just a few examples, and it's hard to show this on a two-dimensional photograph, but in the woods, they're pretty easy to recognize. Here's the Appalachian Trail between the Tom's Run shelters and Camp Michaud, if you know that area, just a few miles from Pine Grove Furnace. And in this section of the AT, there are multiple charcoal hards, and people are walking right through this 19th century history, and they don't even know it. So the charcoal hearth is there. You look for the little pink flags. If you walk through the woods and see pink flags, that's a charcoal hearth. So if you look at the treadway, so people, hikers, as they're going along, are stirring up charcoal dust right under their feet. That's why it's so dark. Here's that image of the slope south of Laurel Lake leading up to Pole Steeple. And that trail itself also goes right through several charcoal hards where you can see others right next to the trail. I'm going to show you this particular charcoal hearth, which the trail goes right through. Here's what it looks like as you're climbing. This is the steep part in the beginning, and everyone finally gets to a flat area and they rest. They're stopping in a charcoal hearth and they have no clue. You look at this area on the downslope side, there is charcoal that has to be 150, 200 years old, eroding from the hill. This is the stuff that was too small to carry back to the furnace, down the slope to the furnace. This is just what they spilled, okay? And if you reach in and grab it, it'll get your fingers dirty, even though it's a little wet. Charcoal does persist for a long time in the environment. So this is charcoal that was made by colliers to supply Pine Grove Furnace, and now it's on a hiking trip. Here's that same charcoal hearth seen from uphill. It's facing the other way. And again, people collapse on that little bench, see them in the summertime. And I don't even bother trying to tell them about history because they think I was a crank. Here's another one. This is along the Appalachian Trail, actually just to the side of it, behind Pole Steeple as you climb up from the park. And this particular hearth demonstrates that the colliers, as they were first forming this hearth, as they're leveling out a flat area on the steep terrain, they find some rocks, they want them out of there, so they would throw them to the side. And that's what you see on the left side of the image. But then in the 20th and maybe the 21st century, modern forest users turn around and grab a few of those rocks and pile them up to make a fire circle. So on the far right, you might be able to see over here that there's a fire circle, which is reversing the hard work of colliers. So what do you look for? So like the sixth sense, so you can see all of these hearths around you. A very flat, very circular area, typically 30 or 40 feet across. They can be as much as 60, although that's pretty rare. They can be a little smaller. I find them typically around 30 feet or so. There are not going to be any rocks in there unless a modern forest user put it in. And they're not wet. It's not a place where you've got a forest, a mountain seep. It needs to be dry. You have baked the soil, possibly repeatedly at 800 degrees. And you've put all this charcoal down, stuff that's spilled. So you've really changed the forest floor. You've changed the pH, you've baked it. Trees don't like to grow back. They will eventually, but it takes a long time. So what tends to come back is huckleberry and things like that. So these tend to stand out because it's a hole in the woods that doesn't have trees in it. And if you think it might be a hearth, go over there and look at it. And you might find a trail through it. You might find evidence someone had a campfire or set up a tent there. It's a convenient flat place. But if you look on the downslope side, you should be able to find some charcoal. If it's in a relatively flat place, you can dig down, maybe 6 to 12 inches down below the modern leaf litter. You should find a layer of charcoal. So that's a hearth. Go out and find it. Okay. To finish this evening's presentation, let's talk about collier huts and haul roads briefly. So, collier huts. Well, I've mentioned that you need to do this process and you need to stay out there and tend the pit. This took a lot of skill. So it took a particular type of worker. This wasn't like wood cutting, wood chopping, where anyone can swing an axe. This was a process that you learned by apprenticeship. It was often passed father to son. So here's one of the superintendents of Pine Grove towards its later years saying we were fortunate to have a set of very dependable men. Here are some of those colliers. You'll see this picture all over the place. If you Google collier hut, this is what comes up. It's sometimes reversed, but this is actually cropped because the picture when it was taken has the photographer's carrying case in the front. It's not supposed to be there. This picture is also a kind of living history reenactment. Joseph Rothrock asked the old-time colliers to come back and build a hut specifically so that he could record it, so he could take a picture of it. And so in this original copy of the Department of Forestry report for 1905, 1906, there's a short essay, and that's the original of the picture you see on the screen. It's right here in this book, including the photographer's carrying case. That's why, if you can see closely, these guys are all older, is because they're probably retired, or as much as you can retire in those days. They're probably not doing this anymore, especially by 1905. The iron industry was really in retreat. Very few furnaces around doing anything. These guys were brought in as living history reenactors, just like Lafayette Hook at Hopewell in 1937. So what's the process? Well, let me just point out that these collier huts have typically a big crude chimney and fireplace on one end. And here's another collier hut in New Jersey. On the left side, you can see that crude chimney. So you're building sort of a hollow space, kind of like a charcoal pit with nothing on the inside. Here's a representation of what the interior might look like for one of the bigger ones. Let's say this is about 20 feet across. These drawings are by Mike Emanuel, who's a local historian in our region who for decades has been crawling around the Michaux, investigating and documenting charcoal hearths and collier huts. And as you can tell, he's also an incredibly accomplished artist. And finally, he wrote everything up and presented it just last year in the journal Pennsylvania Archaeologist. So this is some idea of what an inside of one of these things might look like. And you basically stack up some lengths of wood and you cover it in dirt and leaves and pieces of bark. And it was reported that these constructions look a little flimsy, but they survived thunderstorms and even some snow if they were doing this late in the season. Here's a finished hut. This is again at Hopewell in 1936. Probably in deference to Lafayette Houk's advanced age. This is fancier than most of them, I think, because there's a door, a really nice door, and instead of a crude stone chimney, you can see that there's a metal pipe coming out. So I think they were being a little kind to this 82-year-old gentleman. What do you look for in the woods? Well, it's going to be a little bit like a charcoal hearth. It's a flat, round area, a little bit smaller than most hearths. And the difference is that it's going to have a shallow ditch all the way around. That's the main diagnostic thing. You're looking for a ditch because that's going to hold the timbers that form the wall of the collier hut and maybe also help carry away rain. And most of the time, you're going to find the remains of that crude chimney and fireplace collapsed. Sometimes it collapses on the edge, sometimes into the middle. Sometimes it's not there, and they may have built these occasionally, I guess in the really hot summer, they might have done one without a fireplace. Here's another one. So again, if you find pink flags in the woods, that's one of these. So this is actually in front of my house. You can't quite see it, but in the background is my house. I live on 15 acres next to the Michaud, and we actually have two collier huts. One is quite small, and this one's about 20 feet or so, and you can easily see the collapsed chimney. So I pass this every day between my house and the public road. So again, look for a flat, round area. It's going to have perhaps some trees growing back because we have not really baked the soil. Nonetheless, it has been trampled down, so it tends to stand out in the woods, but not as readily as a charcoal hearth. And you're looking for that ditch and those collapsed rocks. If you find some charcoal hearths in the woods, and there are typically half a dozen or so of them in an area, look for the collier hut because there's got to be one somewhere nearby. The collier huts are hard to find. Those are kind of the prize. I told you there may be as much as 7,000 charcoal hearths. So after you've seen the first 10 or 20 of them, you're like, oh God, here's another hearth. But when you see a collier hut, you get excited. Okay. And conversely, if you do stumble upon a collier hut, look around. There's going to be probably multiple charcoal hearths, probably within 50 to 100 yards. Traditionally, the colliers burn these at the end of the season. So, after 200 years, you're not going to find one of these in the woods, even if they hadn't burned them. So last topic to close out the evening, haul roads. We're out there in the woods making these enormous, these industrial quantities of charcoal. We need to bring it down to the furnace. To do that, you use these large Teamster wagons. Here's a Teamster wagon at Hopewell. And here's another one. They were often brightly painted. Reds and especially blues were very common. Here's a photograph of Pine Grove Furnace in operation. And from left to right, you've got the Paymasters. Today, it's a rental cabin that's still there. The middle building is mule stables back then, but today that's the general store. That's where the Appalachian Trail hikers have their half-gallon challenge of ice cream. And on the right, you've got a building that's no longer there. That's the charcoal storage house or coal barn. Today, the foundation of this building is the gravel parking lot for general store. And you can see one of these big Teamster wagons, and there's 6 mules and a few adults, and sitting on the top edge are 3 boys who probably, I don't know, are 10 or 12 years old, something like that. Do you think they're there just for the photograph? Of course not. They're working and they're learning the trade. You can imagine that these 3 boys, probably their father might be one of those Teamsters standing by the mills. Here's another one. This is over by Laurel. All these buildings, by the way, burned in a wildfire in 1900, a few years after the forge shut down. But you can see that this wagon is filled with charcoal. So as these giant wagons are going back and forth, they tend to wear down the road. In a number of places, you end up with the path being many feet below the surface of the forest on either side. We call this in the US typically a sunken lane or a wagon track. In England, they call it a hollow way, which is a great name, very descriptive, or a harrowed path, and Francis Chemin-Coeur means the exact same thing. So what you're seeing is direct evidence of the Teamster wagon traffic. They're typically not very wide because they're usually one way in a particular location. You're just having one wagon going in one direction. Here's another example. This is a public road. This is High Mountain Road, right close to my mailbox. You can see that it's below the level of the forest on either side, much to the chagrin of our road crew because it doesn't drain water very well. But this is a common thing as you wander through the Michaud. So how do you see a haul road? You're probably walking on it. It's awfully convenient place to put a hiking trail. It tends to be this long, unnaturally straight pathway through the woods. If there are turns, they tend to be very sharp because a slow-moving wagon, even though it's large, can turn. The few places where we have roads that follow the old, driving roads that follow the old haul road, If you're driving, even 20 miles an hour, you really feel it. They may be lower down one of these cut roads. And if there are charcoal hards in the section that you're walking, and if you're on a bit of a slope, the charcoal hards are going to be on the uphill side. Why? Because you're trying to load stuff into the top of the wagon. So it makes it a little bit easier. They're sometimes used today for commercial logging roads or for modern driving roads to the forest. And in just a few places, it may actually be a head race, like I showed you earlier, or even a trace of a railroad. But the show is covered with these haul roads and just a network connecting the charcoal hards with the furnace. So on that note, let me stop here. I thank you very much for your attention. If you want more information, you can go to our website, pinegrowefriends.org. On the left side, there's a tab that says Park Brochures and History, and I've got some short documents there. And you can also email me at pinegrowefriends@gmail.com. So I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments. And what we'll do is we'll take something from here in the room, and then we'll see if there's something on Zoom. So I have gentlemen back there.
When you get the iron, molten iron coming out of the furnace, what is the ratio of iron to slag?
Okay, so the question is, what's the ratio of iron to slag coming out of a blast furnace? Close to 1-to-1 by volume, but not by weight. And I'm not a metallurgist, and so I think that's a really rough approximation. But remember, maybe I didn't mention that this piece of iron ore around here is a little less than half iron. So half or more of this is waste material. Some of it is going to disappear along with some of the charcoal as carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide out the top, but the rest of it binds with our limestone flux and becomes the slag. So imagine if I could magically chemically separate this in half's the pig iron, half plus some limestone becomes the slag. Okay. Do we have any questions on Zoom?
We have one question on Zoom. I'm just gonna let you repeat.
You talked about making charcoal late in the season. Does that mean they stop working in the winter?
So the question was making charcoal. Did the colliers work late in the season? Does that mean during the winter? They might. And once in a while, I've been surprised as I go through the old ledgers for Pine Grove Furnace. You'll see that they were making charcoal in what we would think of, November, December, something like that, but it's not common. I think the reasons they didn't do it in the winter are, number one, they have to live out there. So that's tough if it's, a kind of normal winter back when we had real winters. Also, if there are a lot of winter storms and snow and so forth, that might make the process hard to control, particularly if it gets very windy, that becomes an issue. So they could work later into the season if there was enough wood available. In other words, if there were billets ready for them, but they couldn't work in deep snow or really lousy weather because both personally and for the process, it wouldn't work. Okay. Yes, sir.
How do they separate out the slag from the molten iron?
So how did they separate the slag from the molten iron? The slag is much less dense. So these are both liquids at the temperatures inside the bottom of the furnace, but the slag is floating on top. And so you more or less have a hole at a higher level and the slag comes up.
Okay, so they come out two different points.
Well, yeah, I mean, two different places. So there's a notch they call it a cinder notch in the old style, that would let the slag flow out. And it flows out over here onto the ground and we let it solidify. And then underneath it is the molten pig iron. Another way to do it is to just drain the pig iron. And as soon as the first little bit of slag, so imagine this layer, like whipped cream on top of hot chocolate, how's that? And as all of a sudden the bottom of your cup has a hole in it, and as the chocolate flows out, all of a sudden we've got the whipped cream, the slag. Okay, let's stop, we don't want that. But you got to get rid of it because you can't have it solidify inside the furnace.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions? We'll alternate back and forth between Zoom. Nope. Okay. Yes, please.
Why did they burn their huts when they would more charcoal?
No. Why did they burn the huts? To the extent that is true, it's one of those, sayings. I suspect it's simply because they were filthy dirty. I mean, these guys have been living in the hut for the entire summer, and all that charcoal dust and debris from living and cooking and human stink probably. I don't think anyone would want to reuse that, even if it would survive to the following year. That's my imagination as to why they would do that. And probably a little bit of a celebration. They had finished another coaling season and they had made their year's wages. Yes.
How was the mix of iron ore and limestone and charcoal poured into the top? Blend?
So how do they pour it into the top? So in the old days, you're doing it in layers. And actually, let me see if I can show you the filling process. Might be able to. What you're doing is you have carts. You have, let's not do it. You have basically a really big wheelbarrow, okay? And you're going to dump in a certain amount of charcoal. And then you're going to dump on top of that a certain amount of iron ore, and then a much smaller amount of limestone. And the ratio might be something along the lines of 800 pounds of iron ore and maybe 200 pounds or less of limestone, and a whole lot of charcoal. And by volume, of course, the charcoal is much bigger. So as the charcoal burns, it's going to soften the iron ore above it, and carbon coming off of it, actually the carbon monoxide, is going to cause some chemistry. And I have a little 2-page summary of that on our website or in the back of the room, I think. And that then combines with the limestone flux, and all of the reactions occur. Modern furnaces, a blast furnace today has got all this automation, and it's maybe 100, 200 feet even tall. And you have things blended. You may have little pellets that have the iron ore and some of the flux combined in the pellet. They have much greater air pressures. The whole thing is the same process, but taken to a new level. So in the old days, it's just layers like a wedding cake. Okay. Anything on Zoom?
No, but I have a question.
Okay, in the room, Claire.
Can you put into context how important or how big the iron industry was here compared to the rest of Pennsylvania or the rest of the nation?
So the question is the context of the iron industry here in, say, the South Mountain region, I guess,
Yeah.
compared to the rest of Pennsylvania and the rest of the country. Well, some furnaces did last from the Revolution all the way through to what's sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution after the Civil War. But a lot of the furnaces didn't last that long. So what happened is you had the earliest iron making in southeastern Pennsylvania, and there were other places, for example, Saugus in the 17th century up in Massachusetts. But in this area, a lot of the furnaces and forges and all this processing of material was happening in southeast Pennsylvania. As the population moved west and crossed the Susquehanna, now you find iron ore in the hills around here, and of course, Franklin County off on the west side of the county. And so the heyday would have been really in the first part of the 19th century. But already you were also starting to find iron ore and abundant forests and so forth in the Juniata district, as they called it. So that's now Juniata County and several counties up there. So there was a lot of iron being made there, even as the industry here kind of stumbled forward through the decades. And then things shift once you're able to use stone coal, anthracite, and bituminous coal as coke. That changes the game. And now you've got steam engines. You've got Pittsburgh, even at the time of the Civil War, is being called hell with the lid off, right? You've got northeastern Pennsylvania anthracite. You're starting to take the industry in a whole different direction, including transportation. At that point, sort of to close this question, I mean, it's amazing that these old charcoal furnaces in the middle of the woods kept going as late as they did, because they were antiques. By the time of the Civil War, even, and Pine Grove Furnace, Montalto, and others kept going for decades afterwards. The reason really is they still had raw materials around. The railroads were starting to come in, and that helped them. But also they made a really good product. So by the end of the 19th century, this area, if it's making iron at all, is kind of a specialty niche market. A lot of the iron from Pine Grove Furnace, for example, ended up at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It ended up being made into boilerplate, because a discerning customer knew that this was really good stuff. Charcoal iron is wonderful, but it's very labor intensive, mostly because of the charcoal. The production plant, the furnace itself, are tiny and antiquated. And it's just astonishing that they kept going as long as they did. Whoa, a whole bunch of questions. Stick to the gentleman in the far back there.
You focused on Pine Grove, on out to comparison. Bigger, smaller, later.
It's,
Tell me a little bit about Monalto.
so Monalto, not my area of specialty, but if I recall correctly, it started around 1800 something, I think 1807, something like that. So a little bit later than Pine Grove Furnace, very comparable operation. It ended around the same time, although I can't quote the year to you right now. Monalto and Pine Grove were kind of friendly competition. And in fact, some of the other things they did, like amusement parks, in the years after the Civil War, they both built amusement parks and would kind of advertise things that were clearly pointed at the other one. So they were constantly in competition using, much the same process, roughly the same size of company. If I had to say between the two of them, Pine Grove Furnace was perhaps slightly more successful, but Monalto, did a good iron business too. So, in the front. So yes.
This could be just a matter of total ignorance on my part. I'm going to comment it anyway.
Please.
Came to my brain, Titanic. Comment was made of contaminated core metal.
Yes.
Your comment, please.
Sure. So the question's about the Titanic. So this is a little far afield, but there's a hypothesis that I've read about, and I am not a metallurgist, but I do know that one of the problems with making iron and steel is that if you get too much phosphorus coming out of the iron ore, and you don't somehow get rid of that, and it's difficult to do, the phosphorus ends up creating what's called cold short metal, which means that at room temperature or even colder than that, say the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the metal may be too brittle. And whether it comes out of a blast furnace and you're making it into some cast product in the 19th century, or if you're making it into steel rivets for a huge ocean-going vessel, cold short metal is a problem. And so one theory, as I understand it, is that if, and I know they were having trouble getting enough rivets when they were building that ship in Ireland, that they ended up using cold short metal. And so when it hit the iceberg, the metal broke more easily than it should have. And that maybe if the metal had been of higher quality, if those rivets hadn't snapped, maybe it wouldn't have been such damage. So that's the theory anyhow. Cold short metal with too much phosphorus is I think what you're referring to. Do we have any questions on Zoom?
We have one.
Okay, and then we'll get.
Did pig iron have to be further processed before being made into rails, rifles, structural needs?
So the question is, did you have to process pig metal to do anything else with it? And real fast, yes. The pig iron that you get from the bottom of one of these blast furnaces, and this is still true to this day, that material is very strong in compression, but it's very brittle. And you can cast it into useful shapes like pots and perhaps some types of industrial machine parts and so forth. In the back of the room here, I know Zoom can't see it, but I've got a modern reproduction of a cast pot that's probably very similar to what they made in the early days at Pine Grove Furnace. You can make stove plates, for example. Many of you know about a 10 plate, really a 9 plate stove. So most of the time when you're making pig iron, you're going to transform it. And I think that's what the question's really getting at. You're going to take it to a different industrial process. At Pine Grove, we had something called a finery forge. There's a related process called puddling. In any event, you're going to take your pig iron, you're going to heat it up, burn out the carbon that is present because of that charcoal. The way you make it puts a lot of carbon into it. You burn out the carbon, you smash it under a really big hammer, and you end up with wrought iron, which has very, very little carbon in it. It has a crystal structure that's more flexible. So these different types of metal have different qualities depending on what you're going to do with them. Most of the time, what you're trying to get is the wrought or worked iron, which is then what a blacksmith can use for most purposes, building bridges, a lot of other things. You actually want wrought iron. So I think that's what the question is really aiming at. So there's several questions here. Yes, ma'am.
For those of us at this end of the show,
Okay, it's the south end of the show.
yeah, are there places we can go online to find everything from parts to we don't really want the homes, but anything that would lead us to see some of these things that you spoke of?
Sure. So at the bottom edge here, and I'm not going to read to you because it's a bunch of letters, you can yourself, your computer can withstand doing this. You can go to a Penn State website and the imagery is there. I made these maps by going to this website. So if you pick the right choice, and it's a little complicated, but you can do this and you can actually then find LiDAR holes, which are the charcoal hards. I can't stand here and tell you exactly where to go to Old Forge or something like that, but I promise there are lots and lots of charcoal hards and collier huts and haul roads across the mountain down here too, especially the closer you get to Monalto or to Caledonia.
Yeah.
So they are out there. But if you go to the recording and get that web link, you could do this yourself.
Right.
Okay. So question in the front, and then we'll do the back.
So for a long, long time, I've wondered about a series of homes along Mountain Creek Campground, 233.
Mountain Creek Campground, Pine Grove Road actually is
Pine Grove Road, yeah.
east of our park. Yeah.
As well as just past the twirly top of 34, there's a series of homes that are all, very, very, very similar in origin in terms of architecture. And I was always wondering if they might have been originally associated with Pine Grove in terms of village or
Right.
more associated with the Sandstone
Right.
Forest.
So the question is very similar looking homes and clusters. Toland
Yeah,
is one
totally.
example.
Yeah,
So yeah, a
absolutely.
lot of those exactly are workers' houses for the mining industries, including for sand and clay. And I'll refer you to books by Randy Watts, another local historian who I haven't mentioned this evening, but his wonderful book about the charcoal iron industry is on the back table. He has a book about the clay and sand industries that talks about this.
So they don't
So-
date back to.
So the question you're asking also is any of those industrial workers' homes, are they related to Pine Grove?
Right.
Well, no, because the area around Laurel Lake burned several times. It burned in 1872. They rebuilt it because the forge was still operating. But then in 1900, there was a bad wildfire, and again in 1915. And there were also fires in 1930s. There were some really bad wildfires, and so all the houses burned. So the ones closer in. It is also possible that some of those wildfires actually hit original structures further along. There are a few workers' homes that were preserved and later turned into cabins, just a few of them, right around more in the center of our park. The oldest one is 1860, but most of them date to the 1920s and 30s and were purpose-built for recreation. So the wildfires, unfortunately, got rid of a lot of those older houses. We'll get to the questions in the room. Are there any others in Zoom?
There's a question about how can we obtain this week's and last week's recording?
So how can you get the recordings from last week, which is Claire, who was just speaking, and myself this evening? So the Friends of Michaud State Forest has a YouTube channel that was just created. And Claire and John are very nice to have done the digital work. And Claire's talk from last week is posted. So if you go to YouTube and look for the Friends of Michaud, you should be able to find it. And if things have gone well this evening, the recording of this talk will be there probably pretty soon. So I'll get to you. There was a question back here. It was you, yes.
Yeah, I know the Armory and Harper's Ferry got most of their pig iron from the furnaces in the Shenandoah Valley, because they just load it on rafts and load it down the Shenandoah River. But did any of the furnaces up here try to supply the Armory? Do you have any records?
I have no idea. I haven't seen the Armory at Harper's Ferry mentioned in the records up here. I tend to doubt it because there were lots of other furnaces between here and there. And as far as products from up here in Pennsylvania going that far away, transportation was one of the major limitations on the industry around here. Mountain Creek provides enough water to turn water wheels, but you can't float a boat down it. We're a long way from anything. And until the railroads came in after 1870 at Pine Grove, you couldn't get stuff very far very easily. They did send stuff as far as Pittsburgh on backs of horses in the early days, things like that. A lot of it was more the domestic market. In later years, eastward, as I mentioned, boilerplate or car wheels for the Baldwin Locomotive Works outside of Philly. So, but I don't really know for sure. Question in the front?
Just a comment, we'll have on our website, on the Institute website, we'll have the link also.
Okay.
for these programs.
So just to say, the recording of last week's talk and this week's talk will also be on the website for the Institute for hosting us this evening in Waynesboro. In the back.
Comment regarding the LiDAR maps, images. two words to remember, BASDA or PASTA, is the portal now that has that data in it.
Okay.
And then the second is LiDAR. You'll come to the PASTA portal and just type in the what you're looking for, and that will come up with a bunch of options.
So let me repeat that. So gentleman in the room is saying that to get LiDAR data, you can go to PASDA on the internet, on the web, and you should be able to use that as a portal to get LiDAR. And also this web link here is actually how I generated these. But yeah, so there's ways in which any one of you can play with the LiDAR.
And the resolution is 6 inches, vertical resolution. So that's why you can see even the smallest trails.
So the resolution is 6 inches vertical. In other words, that laser bouncing down, you can measure very, very precisely the time it takes, and that translates to distance. But the horizontal resolution is more like around a meter, right? John, is that about right? Yeah, so in this sense, it's a little less precise. However, that's plenty enough in order to find something that's 20 feet across. Or as I showed you, even to see a hiking trail on the mountain slope, Pole Steeple Trail, which is only about that wide, shows up very nicely if you look carefully. So the vertical resolution, the elevation, is what makes this so useful, as you're pointing out. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else on Zoom? Nothing else on Zoom. Anyone else in the room have anything they'd like to say? Yes, please. No.
How did the wildfire start? Is it known?
How did the wildfires start? Of course, there are a lot of reasons, but one, at least according to the newspapers and the official reports in the 19th century, one reason is that they were set deliberately. Now, the reason is that you've got a pretty devastated forest land, even though the trees are growing back, and once the charcoal industry ended, the iron industry no longer needed it. You're growing back trees, but it's a lot of scrub. And sometimes it seems like these fires may have been set deliberately by people in order to get rid of some of the scrub and allow huckleberries to grow back. So that's just one possible reason. Of course, there's going to be accidents. There's going to be, someone's campfire gets out of control. I should mention in this regard that was it last Saturday afternoon, there was we hope was an accidental fire near Pole Steeple. You can actually see it from the hiking trail if you go up there. It was put out after it took away a few acres. And actually, I'm going to show it to you because it actually reveals. Yep. So on March 5th, talking about wildfires, this is taken just where the Pole Steeple hiking trail kind of goes off to one side and makes it kind of more gradual climb. So there's a switchback in the trail. And just down, so you can see the burned area very easily. Just down slope, there's a charcoal hearth, which stands out in this particular sad event because you can just see it. All of the scrub got removed, all of the small growth because of this wildfire. Doesn't look like it was too bad. I hope it didn't kill a lot of trees, but a little scary. Now we don't know what happened. The fire marshal's investigating. I don't know if they will figure it out, but you got to wonder if it could have been even a campfire because there is a fire circle back edge of that charcoal hearth. So this is off the trail, but not very far off. You can see it from the trail. So it could be a lot of things about these fires, but some of them were probably arson for economic reasons. And there may even have been other arsons. In 1942, there were a series of fires up and down the mountain chain that they said were arson, and it seems to have been some kind of other mischief. So thank you. That's interesting. Any other comments or questions in the room? Okay, everyone is stunned. So thank you all for your attention. Do we have any last questions on Zoom? No? Okay, everyone's about had enough history. I respect that. Thank you very much for your attention.